So hey anime fans, the series name is What If Naruto Got Harem with Dragon Ball Z, so let's start the series. Sucking in a breath, the evil being made of dark magic released a scream heavy with ki, and as the giant orb of energy started to overpower and disintegrate the evil, magical entity known throughout the universe as Majin Buu, he remembered something from before the Fat One had been removed. He had broken through the barriers of space and time by focusing ki to his throat and screaming his rage. Since he now had more power and the Fat One could no longer hold back his full power, it would be easier. The ki started to rip open a portal to a different dimension, through which Majin Buu was able to push a fair amount of his body before it closed and the rest of him was destroyed. The idea that the evil they had attempted to eradicate was actually still alive and strong and would someday return to them was unknown to the people who lived in the universe where Buu had been formed. The Narutoverse. Namake's Minato stared resolutely into the eyes of the chakra monster that the masked man, who could only have been Uchiha Madara, had unleashed upon his beloved village. This vicious and uncontrollable beast would destroy everything that he, as the Yondaime Hokage, had vowed to protect with his life. He could not allow that to happen. Using the Shiki Fujin in conjunction with the 8 trigrams sealing method was a death sentence, and he barely had the chakra for either, so it was now or never. Kushina was assisting, but she would probably not make it through the night either. Minato quickly gathered the chakra he would need for the Shiki Fujin while the monster was preoccupied with his wife Kushina's chakra chains. But he stopped when his instinct told him that the Shiki Fujin wouldn't be a good idea, that he wouldn't survive the sealing, of course, and that the village still needed him. He was briefly undecided, but he followed his instincts, which, it should be noted, had very, very rarely led him wrong, and made do with the 8 trigrams sealing method. When the beast saw the ceremonial dais that Minato had called forth for the sealing, it attempted to kill him and his son, but Kushina was able to stop it in time, just in time, so that Minato only suffered a minor cut on his back. Minato noticed that his son's eyes and face had changed as the beast was drawn into him. Little Naruto's pupils were now slitted, and his whisker lines were thicker. He had never heard of Mito-sama having children with whisker-marked cheeks, but now they were more obvious and gave him a feral appearance. As he collapsed backward onto the floor, Minato realized that even though they both had severe cases of chakra exhaustion, he and Kushina might survive the night. Minato couldn't explain why his son had whisker marks on his cheeks. They might be the result of a child born from a Jinchuriki's womb. After 16 years, the Jounin, who is known to the entire ninja community as Namake's Naruto, was devastated to learn that his father had been killed by the Gold and Silver brothers, Ginkaku and Kinkaku, who had been brought back to life. Although they had been vanquished thanks to his father's efforts, it still hurt because he had no family left, especially since his mother had passed away 10 years prior from a debilitating illness she had contracted when he was born, and the damn Shinobi Alliance wouldn't let him do anything about it if they had any say in it. Killer Bee, the host of the 8-tailed Ushioni from Kumogakure no Sato, attempted to console him, but Naruto was distraught. Sure, he had managed to conceal the Kyuubi's chakra, but now he had no father to save. Nevertheless, he had a duty that had been left to him by all those who had come before him. He had mastered his father's methods and even improved on one of them. He could exact revenge on his father and put an end to this senseless war. Through a combination of his senjutsu skills, the Rinnegan, the Kyuubi's chakra, and the eyes that Nagato, the Hiraishin, the Raijin no Ken, and the Raisin Shuriken had given him, he also possessed a slight ability with Mokuton in addition to his Futon Jutsu. Additionally, Kakshi had observed that the Mokuton appeared to be positively affected when compared to Tenzo's, so with everything combined, he could likely accomplish this. Naruto didn't notice the pink goo that appeared behind him as he prepared to do what he had to do. It quickly grew into a small child, dressed only in armbands, baggy pants, and black boots with gold trim. It then took note of Naruto and sensed his power and the hatred that had once fueled it. Buu could feel that hatred calling to him, pleading with him to become one with it. So he made the decision to do it. Before Killer Bee could notice him or take any action, Majin Buu ran to Naruto and wrapped himself around the boy who had captured his attention. As Naruto struggled to free himself, believing that Kabuto had concocted this, Killer Bee made an unsuccessful attempt to assist him. As his form was completely covered in the monster's flesh, he started to lose his vision and decided he had to try Senjutsu because it was the only thing that seemed to give him the strength to free himself at that moment. As he started to absorb Buu's power from his surroundings and the energy of the earth, he noticed that he and this stuff were becoming one more quickly rather than the process of his absorption slowing down. Naruto was unaware that Buu's absorption technique was only intended to draw from the victim, not to fully integrate with them. By absorbing Buu's energy as Buu was absorbing him, he was simulating the effect of the pot-era earrings and increasing the process power-boosting characteristic by a factor of 3 by absorbing the energy of the world as well. As their psyches blended and they became one, Naruto's will and Buu's clashed for dominance, and Naruto used force of will to subvert Buu's mindless homicidal tendencies and significantly reduce his rage. However, in exchange, the resulting melded person became somewhat more vindictive and volatile. Additionally, he sensed that the meld was affecting the Kyuubi, also known to itself and its fellow Biju as Kurama. He waited to join the mental battle for control until he had only one opponent left to face before hurling his considerable will at it. The chakra beast met with a level of power and willpower he had never even imagined before and was quickly assimilated. Kurama's speech patterns and behavioral inclinations would serve as a sort of foundation for the acts that the being would do, while Majin Buu would provide the majority of the being's sheer power and wrath and Naruto would provide the worldview and much of the personality. Killer Bee felt the power of this new person, whose loyalty he could not be certain of, as the goose settled and started to take on a recognizable shape. It was enough to shake him to his core and knock him to his hands and knees, preventing him from escaping or interfering further. When Majin Naruto, the creature who was now a mostly sane and rational fusion of Namikaze Naruto, Kurama of the Biju, and Majin Buu, finally came into focus and regained his normal coloring, it was to show that he looked remarkably similar to Naruto, with only a few differences to indicate Buu's additions. He still had his naturally tanned skin and blonde hair, but it was much longer than even his father's had been, reaching halfway down his back. He was also much taller, at least 8.5 feet, and he was still wearing his crimson sage coat over his now black jounin vest and long-sleeved red shirt with the vest unzipped. The sleeves of his shirt tapered down into the black and gold-trimmed arm braces he now wore, and he was dressed in Majin Buu's belt, baggy pants, and stylized boots, though the pants were now black. Additionally, he had a combination of Majin Buu's eyes from when he still had Fat Buu, which made him less evil, and the Rinnegan's eyes, with Kurama's slit pupils and rippled white sclera surrounding a white iris until it approached the edge of his visible eyes, where it turned completely black. Other than his eyes, his facial features remained the same. All in all, his torso resembled an alien, which was appropriate given that he was half of one, albeit one made through black mystic arts, and that traveling dimensions took a long time if they weren't already connected, like the room in that floating platform was to Buu's home dimension. He was also more barrel-chested and slimmer in the abdomen, and his arms were both larger and more well-defined. His hands were a little out of proportion, but he could handle it. Then he saw B gasping for air on the ground and realized that his power was even greater than before. He controlled it as best he could, and B fell to the ground. B, Mr. Satan and his dog that he had probably killed, he'd make sure this friend didn't die, and he still had an appointment with Madara and Kabuto. He knew Kabuto's chakra best, so he'd go there first. He looked for the chakra point that he knew to be the Snake Sanin's apprentices, and he saw that Sasuke and Itachi were going in that direction with Nagato. Well, he'd take care of Itachi first and keep B safe before dealing with Kabuto. Despite the fact that Meijin Naruto was worse than both Bu and Naruto, he persisted and waited until B was able to stand before taking any action. That pink stuff was a living organism. B, we became one being. I am strong enough now that I can win this war by myself. The Kyuubi no longer exists as well, having been assimilated into my current form, so Madara's plan is more or less useless, he said, giving B some time to adjust to his newfound strength. Itachi and Pain, who I assume are being controlled by Kabuto, are on their way here. I'll deal with them. B began to object, but Naruto vanished before he could utter a word. Naruto's abilities halted Itachi and Nagato in their stops when he materialized in front of them. Itachi stammered as he spoke, "Who are you?" "Hello Itachi, Nagato, it's been a long time since we've met face to face like this," Naruto said with a kind of evil smile. They flinched when they realized it was Naruto, and Itachi tried to look him in the eye. "Trying to use the genjutsu you put on the crow you shoved down my throat to free yourself, Itachi?" he asked, which made Itachi inhale deeply. "Yeah, I absorbed that when me and Meijin Bu fused into one being. Shursui's Manjikyu is mine now," Itachi said. "How do you know these things?" "You were never told, I know that," he objected. Kabuto said, "I read your mind, foolish Uchiha," which stopped him. "Don't be foolish, of course it's possible, I'm doing it right now, and no you're not giving away any tell on your body, you know that, you've got to accept this if you want to get onto the fight as well." Kabuto, and Nagato? "Thanks for the eyes, they are really useful," said Kabuto before the three humans who were listening to Naruto did nothing for a moment. Before they could move, Naruto was in front of them and gave them both a strong gut punch that broke them in two. As they started to pull themselves together, Naruto grabbed his left pinky and tore it off, confusing the two people fighting him as well as the man in charge of them. The pinky then turned pink and gelatinous before growing into a second Naruto, which created a spacetime barrier that would keep them in the same area for however long the clone had it. After saying, "I'm gonna come kill you now Kabuto, or maybe I'll absorb you too, I'm sick of your annoying presence but your knowledge may be useful," Naruto started to walk away, throwing a final shot behind him. He was fast now, ridiculously so, stronger physically, and had more chakra than the bijou he contained. Based on what he had sensed through Itachi and Pain, he had likely gained control over his bijou, which made sense, but where had the flight come from? Kabuto started to try to come up with a plan to stop this new incarnation of Naruto as he levitated into the air and took off flying to his energy signature. How could Konan employ real wings when even Nagato could only levitate for a short time? After the extraction was completed, perhaps he ought to dissect him. He looked around for hostages at that point and saw Mitarashi Anko, the crazy, sexy woman he had captured when Tenzo had left his mission with her to try to help him during the fight with Nagato. He decided to heal her and suck the power out of the seal beforehand, looking down on her. That's when Naruto crashed through the ceiling and punched Kabuto in the stomach hard enough to knock him into the far wall and through it. It didn't take long to drain the proto-curse seal's power, and it didn't take long to heal her. When she came to, he got up and extended his hand to her. She stabbed it and fled, screaming that he hadn't caught her off guard again. He sighed slightly but left her alone, then turned to face the spot where he had punched Kabuto. The man was now standing in the hole in the wall, breathing heavily and spitting blood. He boasted haughtily, "That was a good hit, Namikaze-san. You broke my ribs and spine, and cracked my skull too. But you forget about my regeneration. I can passively heal that damage, and it's even better now that I've surpassed Orochimaru-sama." Before Naruto punched his head so hard that it almost collapsed. He picked up Kabuto's body and absorbed it, learning its knowledge and memorizing it before it died. He then noted that there were multiple forms of Sage Mode and that he now knew 2 of them, mixing Toad and Dragon. "It's Meijin Naruto now Kabuto, and I don't let my enemies monologue anymore," he said. What would that yield? Now that he was curious, he made the decision to give it a try. He first sat down to meditate and gather the world's energy in the way he had learned on Mount Myobokuzen. As the natural energy gathered around him, he developed the characteristic orange pigmentation around his eyes. He then started using the Ryuchi cave method, which caused him to gain scales and brill, as well as a paler complexion, and he soon developed 4 horns on the back of his head. After completing his meditations, Naruto's eye pigmentation was more along the lines of a dark brown, almost black, and his muscles were a little larger, and he had developed a nearly prehensile tail. He stood up and then recalled that Kabuto had used Jugo's DNA to stabilize the form and gather natural energy while moving. He could do that too, since Kabuto had left the excess in the cave in case he ever needed to experiment more with it. Meijin Naruto celebrated his new power as he moved to the location where it was stored. He could feel his strength, speed, perception, reaction times, and even his senses of sight, hearing, and smell were sharper. Naruto was able to adjust to this form almost immediately after injecting himself with Jugo's DNA. He could feel the natural energy flowing into him and knew that it wouldn't require any effort at all to stay in this form indefinitely. The effect grew stronger over a few moments, but Naruto let it go because he knew it wouldn't reach a point where it could overwhelm him because it was already slowing down and, oh, there. It had stabilized and he would be able to maintain the minimum amount of energy required to keep Sage Mode active for as long as needed. Naruto jumped up quickly and pondered if he should go collect B before facing Madara because Madara was the one who started this whole conflict in the first place. The feedback indicated that one of the individuals revived by the technique had managed to keep themselves anchored to this plane, which was terrible. Naruto went through the hand seals required to release the Edo Tensei, changing his chakra signature to match Kabuto's so that the Edo Tensei would actually end. Naruto took to the skies once more and swiftly flew to B's position, feeling a little concerned about him, as he should have since both the Raikage, and the Godame Hokage, who was elected after his father lost an arm to Itachi during the massacre and had retired, Senju Tsunade, were in his way and weren't planning to back down. B wasn't backing down either, stating that he needed to help Naruto, of all the dumb things. Naruto slowed down a little and floated down to the earth looking even more alien than he already was. B stopped his fight when he saw Naruto and gave him the thumbs up before approaching him. As a greeting, he said, "Yo, Mr. 9, your new body looks pretty fly. But hey, yo, what's up with it? You looked pretty normal when we last hit fists," he added, extending his fist for Naruto to bump into, which he did to prevent a tantrum. He responded in his new, more sophisticated speech, a quality he inherited from Kurama. I learned from Kabuto's mind the secret of the Ryuchi cave method of attaining sage mode and a way to gather natural energy while moving B-san, and as for the question on my ability to fly, which I think we both know you're dying to ask about, well, I got that from the entity that I fused with earlier. It was called Majin Buu, for your information, he said. Naruto's head jerked back, but that was all. He pressed his head against I's fist and glared at him, saying, "If you do that again, Raikage-san, I will eat you." The Raikage took a few steps back, and be protested by rapping, which was admittedly awful. "Yo, Naruto, don't kill my bro, yo, fool, ya fool." E and B perspired. "Very well, B-san, I will only hospitalize him for a few months," they said. After deciding that he didn't like Naruto's tone, went to deck him in the face once more, but this time he didn't hit him. Instead, he passed right by him, as if through him. In fact, E spun and tried again, and again, and again, until he finally turned into a blur of brown skin and lightning, missing every blow or appearing to pass through his target. But after a while, Tsunade and B saw the ground beneath Naruto and several distinct footprints that overlapped at the heels and pointed in all directions, indicating that Naruto was moving quickly enough to avoid detection and leave behind afterimages that E was passing through. B finally stopped him and asked Naruto, in the style of a really awful rap, of course, "Hey-oh, Mr. 9-0. Can I be the one to fight my bro, yo? If you want, but I still want one good clean hit on this snail-pacing old man who's wasting time I could be using to take out Madara," Naruto testily replied. B nodded somewhat hesitantly, uncertain if it would be a good idea and still a little intimidated by what he had previously felt of Naruto's chakra. "You really don't want to try to stop me, Tsunade. I'm a being beyond the capability of your race to understand now, and my power is like unto what you view as a god's," Naruto said to the woman who had been his Hokage as the AB duo worked out their differences. She sneered at this and slammed one fist into the other. "You're definitely Naruto alright, just as cocky as he always was, if a bit more well-mannered and silver-tongued, but you aren't getting past me," she said with a fist. "As the Godame Hokage, I will stop you, even if I have to hospitalize you." It was Naruto's turn to scoff this time. "Tsunade, you couldn't defeat Pain, even with my father's assistance, and I defeated him when I was weaker than I was before I became as unbelievably powerful as I am now," she said with a slight snort, obviously not believing his claims to power. "So you don't believe that I have ascended as I claim to have, then?" he said, raising his left hand to the side and generating his ki into one hand, creating an energy bomb that would destroy the nearby mountain. "Then witness what I can do without exerting any real effort," he said. Naruto smirked a little as he launched the bomb and waited for the few seconds it would take for it to reach the mountain and explode, feeling more than a little happy to have a test run of his power. The shockwave didn't hit for a while because he was momentarily outrun by its explosion, which was growing to proportions even he hadn't anticipated. When it did, however, Tsunade was blown off her feet, along with B and E, who had just concluded their grudge match, and sent tumbling for a good few dozen meters before they regained their bearings and stuck to the ground with chakra as best they could. Naruto was uniformly unaffected, with only his sage coat, vest, and baggy pants billowing in the wind along with his hair. "These barely take up a millionth of the power I can wield. This level of power is nothing to me. This planet is something I can destroy and not even notice the energy requirements for having done so," he said, turning to face them as he raised both of his hands this time, creating more energy bombs, one at the tip of each finger. They shook, obviously alarmed by the excessive display of power and his current ability to do it quickly without perspiring. The sage nodded in satisfaction and turned to Tsunade, saying, "He'll likely need you to heal him up," before levitating and starting to fly towards Madara's energy signature. "You and your brother are finished, yes?" he asked, laughing, and addressing B directly. "Then it is time for my punch," B said slowly. Naruto then disappeared from their view and reappeared in front of the Raikage, giving him a single clean hit in the solar plexus, appearing to only jabbed at him lightly. When Naruto arrived, Madara was actually getting ready to fight the allied shinobi forces. He made some snide remarks about Naruto's weakness and incapacity to stop him, seemingly not realizing that he was Kurama's former host and being a little insane. Out of curiosity, Naruto let him mix the Biju's energy, but he found the resulting beast to be weak and barely at the Super Saiyajin level of threat, not an opponent on par with Son Goku, to put it mildly. Even after taking into consideration any aging he may have had, the guy who he discovered to be not Madara at all didn't resemble the scant paintings and other images of him that the shinobi world still retained. Since he had a fully developed Eternal Manjikyu Sharingan and had absorbed it before it could fully die, Naruto had no idea who the fraud was, but it didn't matter because it gave him an incredible boost to the Sharingan's time dilation effect. Naruto decided to look at his eyes, which were now as strong as they were going to get. He took a mirror from the ceiling scroll in his pocket and looked into it, observing his pupils, which were still slit but now had a vertical bar through them, just like in his first Sage mode. The very outside of his sclera were black, just like Majin Buu's had been, and he liked them because they were very intimidating. A few hundred kilometers to the east, he sensed a powerful chakra that was stronger than any other chakra on the planet except his own. That must have been the person who had been brought back to life in some way, because he could simply absorb that person and put an end to this war right then and there. However, before taking off, Naruto recalled the method Buu had used to move from planet to planet, one that involved instantaneous movement between two locations with no downtime, so he locked onto that powerful chakra and used the instant displacement, technique. When he arrived, he noticed a meteor in the sky. It was being held back by Old Man Oanoki, but there was another in its path. Naruto shoved the old man aside and launched a somewhat potent energy attack at the meteors, vaporizing them instantly. He telepathically contacted the Buu clone, too. He had created and instructed it to create a few more Kage Bunshin and have them back up the others as best they could against the various Zetsu clones and then proceed to come back and remerge with the original. He then turned to the man on the cliff and saw him looking more than a little taken aback, as if he couldn't believe that Naruto had removed his pathetic attack. The others were largely safe, which was good, but the clones were mostly out of chakra. "Hello, that attack was a fairly good warm-up, please, throw me another, it would really get the blood flowing." Naruto smirked at him as he floated down to the ground on a pillar cliff that was at a similar level. He then turned away from the man and said, "But before you do, allow me to address my allies," before turning to face the allied shinobi forces. "Hello to you as well, my allies. I am the one you know as Naruto, and through an accident of fate, I am more powerful than anyone or anything you have ever heard of, and the Kyuubi whom I used to contain is now dead. I will handle this worm, so please, get as far away as you can in the fastest manner," he said. The crowd below him gasped and cried out, thinking he was dead, but then they noticed that the upper half of Naruto's body wasn't falling down like his lower half had. He floated there for a moment before turning to face this man who, for some reason, had the Rinnegan. He would have continued, but the man from the other column had decided to cut him in half at the waist with his Susanoo-OS blade because his pinkish-white aura was blazing to life and painted the surrounding area in an eerie pink that made them all shiver a little. "Take a seat," he said, handing him away through several columns. "That was very impolite, sir, please dash. I'll just get to beating him down now, so please, continue to evacuate the area," he said, glancing briefly at the lower part of his body before it turned pink, flew up to meet him again, and reformed into his legs. He cracked his neck slightly while observing those below him inform him that the man was Madara and that he would require assistance. "So then, the Edo Tensei is still in total effect for you even after I ended it? That's good to know, means I have no excuse not to absorb you, but still, bring out your best techniques. I want to crush you while you are at your best and think that you're unbeatable," he said, turning once more and walking to the edge of his pillar before floating down to the area where Madara was reforming his body after it disintegrated upon contact with the earth after moving at the speeds it had been traveling. "Very well, I shall show you the despair of my ultimate Susanoo. It will appropriately demonstrate the difference in our strengths. You should count yourself fortunate that Hashirama is truly dead and thus incapable of fighting me. It will limit the extent to which you will need to redraw the maps," Madara said, growling and leaping out of his crater, so furious that he failed to notice how big and deep it was. As Madara's Susanoo grew to Bijou-like proportions, Naruto sneered. "Does something so feeble make him hopeless?" Naruto moved swiftly, tearing through the Susanoo like a knife through butter, and punched Madara hard enough in the stomach to knock him out of his Susanoo, which instantly collapsed because the insane former head of the Uchiha clan was no longer making it active. As if that would even make him perspire for the victory. He then took hold of Madara's neck and threw him into the air with one hand, but Madara ignored him and continued to punch and kick Naruto in any available area. This was obviously pointless because Naruto could only feel the blows as a slight pressure, and he simply grinned condescendingly up at the struggling ninja legend. Naruto then started to absorb the man, whose eyes contained the panic and despair he had attempted to convey. He gave him one final piece of information: "I was planning to do this from the beginning, but I always did like to play with my food. How do you like the taste of despair, Uchiha Madara?" When the insane Uchiha was fully absorbed, Naruto was amazed by the man's knowledge. He had so many jutsu and so much ability with the various eye-based powers, which was useful to say the least. He was as strong as this planet could make him, perhaps as strong as this dimension could make him. The man didn't respond, instead shrinking into his palm and mostly covered in Naruto's flesh. Meijin Naruto was aware that all of those people, including Hinata, would eventually die, and that in order to avoid needless problems, he might as well just leave the dimension. However, as these thoughts raced through his mind, he also realized that he still had people in this realm that he needed to protect, including a girl who loved him in Hinata, who was the person he truly cared about, and that he might still be able to heal his father and bring him back to life like he had the dog be back on the other Earth. He didn't want to have to deal with people being devastated. After his Bu clone had finally arrived and remerged with him, he made the decision to kill Madara right away and leave an explosion in his wake to give the impression that he had died. Naruto used his dimensional hole-creating technique to charge up a massive death ball, which, if it were as powerful as he could make it through the compression of his energy, would have destroyed the planet, but instead he only had the power to form an enormous crater that should not kill anyone in its path. He then made a regular shadow clone and slipped into his portal. POV of Naruto's world. They lamented the passing of their hero, the man who could defeat Madara Uchiha. Naruto had been extolled and statues erected. Hinata had fallen into a depression from which it would take 3 years for Kiba, Shino, Kurenai, and Konohamaru to pull her out. She eventually married Kiba. Sakura also did so, but it took Tsunade, Kakashi, Shizune, Ino, and Sai to pull her out, and she wed Sai. After several months, Tsunade had come to terms with his passing and proclaimed Sharingan Kakashi the Rokudame Hokage, a role he performed brilliantly in honor of his departed pupil. However, they still had to deal with the aftermath of the Fourth Great Shinobi War. Zetsu clones continued to pour out in their thousands, and the Shinobi Alliance suffered several significant losses without Naruto to identify them. Uchiha Sasuke was also still on the warpath, killing any shinobi or kunoichi that he recognized as being from Konoha. It took 3 of the 5 Kages to defeat him, and in the process, he killed Onoki. After Tenzo was eventually located and set free, Zetsu's ability to produce clones was crippled, and he was only able to produce a dozen instead of the thousands he had previously been able to. This ultimately resulted in a protracted war of attrition in which Zetsu clones would employ guerrilla tactics to avoid suffering losses in order to increase their numbers for a heavy assault that would bring them back down for relatively low casualties among the Alliance. Following several months of combat, the Alliance Intelligence Division would finally succeed in finding Zetsu, using the lone Zetsu clone they had taken and secured as a guide. The war ended a few days later, and the people of the elemental nations adopted a peaceful way of life in remembrance of those who had died in the bloodiest, yet shortest, Shinobi World War. Naruto's perspective. Naruto reflected on his knowledge of his now nearly limitless power as he traversed space and time. He possessed Mokuton, the ability to manipulate gravity, the Rinnegan, ultimate Susanoo, and a variety of other abilities. He was also skilled in the art of sealing, and he understood the workings of these abilities as well as how to use them effectively. However, what did he want to do with them? He didn't really care to gain more power than he already had, and he was traveling to an unfamiliar realm with no idea what he would discover. Unless he chose to use seals to increase his control, which would lock the power he put into his energy beams and/or bombs to 1 or 2 settings, he had all the power he needed and could control it as well as he probably ever would. However, once more, what was he going to do with all of this power he had? In addition to being fairly certain that he wouldn't particularly care to go around correcting the wrongs of the multiverse as he believed the original Naruto would have done, he also didn't want to go on a killing spree through the various dimensions like Buu would have. This left him with the option of finding a way to pass the time, perhaps by taking on an apprentice. Or even start a family. Turn the world around by taking actions they believed were impossible. Concepts that are intriguing. Perhaps he could even construct an archenemy for himself to play with. It seemed as fun as anything else he could do that wasn't overtly and directly murderous. The future path was essentially chosen, and Meijin Naruto closed his eyes to meditate as he zipped across space to the next world, where his very presence would turn everything upside down. The realm that Naruto had visited must have been cosmically close to his own, but he had still had time to collect the natural energy from that void, energy that had taken root in his system of its own accord and evolved into a source of energy that his body could now produce on its own. Naruto left the dimensional rift sooner than Buu had. Standing on a massive reddish stone cliff that rose far above the sea and beyond normal sight, he looked back at the land where he had appeared and saw wide open spaces and rolling hills. In the distance, he could see the outline of a city with a large, opulent building dominating it. He assumed it was at least a major city, if not the capital of the nation he was in, whichever that was. He ascended into the air and glided slowly toward the city, taking in the scenery and tranquility as he went. It took him 10 minutes, longer than Naruto had anticipated, which gives one an idea of how big the city was. In a sense, Naruto was approaching one of the city's massive gates, which dwarfed those he had seen in the elemental nations, though some of the ones he recalled Buu coming across, and then destroying, or larger if perhaps less elaborate. As he passed through the gate, one guard tried to stop him, and two more started to assist the first. As he saw more guards approaching, Naruto sighed and let loose his energy, a term he came up with while traveling in the dimensional void, for the various energy types that he could still control. The key from the Saiyajin universe, the void plane wavelength, as he decided to call it because it pulsed through his body like a wave, and the various chakra types had swirled together in a vortex of chaotic energy that he could tell he still had a decent amount of control over, in a burst of murderous intent. The guards that were close enough to see him pass out in a split second, and Naruto felt the urge to kick something solid enough to survive the experience, but he had no such object. There was a barely perceptible foot-sized hole in the right side of the southeast gate, and later that day, several guards reported an unusual tremor traveling over a huge portion of wall, alerting the higher-ups to Whitebeard's presence. However, Naruto was unaware of this. His only goal was to locate a library or other knowledge repository, or a computer if they had something akin to the internet. He could acquire crucial information about the Saiyajin's universe, including who was in control, who had actual power, what powers existed in this world, and whether or not this world was even worth his time. Before asking, "Where is the closest library? I have a bit of research I need to do," he pulled aside a pretty brunette and stared at her for a moment. The woman trembled for a few long moments as Naruto became angrier, and then he slammed his tail into the ground, cratering it in a circle that was 40 feet around them and 10 feet deep. "Speak, now," he said. Naruto thanked the woman and levitated himself out of the hole and back to the earth before heading to the militarily controlled library in the middle of the palace. He was halted halfway there, though, by a brief man. An onion? A person with several guards surrounding him, whom Naruto assumed were there to threaten others. Goelmo asked his guards in an interested and slightly agitated tone, "What kind of low-born trash is this thing? And why isn't it bowing before the mighty Saint Goelmo as it should?" They simply shrugged, having never seen anything even remotely like Naruto before, and tried to make him bow. He warned them of the folly of this by smashing one into a building with his tail. The man then looked at Naruto from different perspectives and exclaimed in his sulky, filthy voice, "It must be some sort of fishman, I want it. This fishman is now my property." "Property?" Naruto asked, his anger building since the man had stopped him. "You think to make me a slave?" he asked incredulously. "And this is allowed? This mewling, slimy little ball of lard is allowed to enslave another person? And yet you still call him a saint?" The bastard simply nodded, trying not to look at him. "For far less of an insult have I ended men far stronger than you, worm," Naruto said as he started to leak killing intent. Goelmo became enraged and began to wave his weapon, which Naruto recognized as a gun, a primitive weapon better suited to his world's technological marvels than the technological marvels Buu had seen in his home universe. He went on without protesting, without even noting that the man, who appeared to be a world noble of some sort, had said, "I won't kill you though, scum such as yourself is unworthy of my direct involvement in their death," adding, "I will merely destroy you, Tsukuyomi." Naruto used the power he had been most interested in since obtaining it, and he felt a little guilty about it. It wasn't that he thought the man should have been treated any less, rather, it was just that he didn't like the idea of using a technique that had sent Sasuke to exact revenge and put Kakashi in a coma. He didn't like the technique, but the only true genjutsu skills he possessed came from the Sharingan, and the lesser techniques didn't carry the same mental and physical brain damage carryover. After questioning him inside Tsukuyomi's world, Naruto's guards all called out to contact an admiral, but Naruto had already knocked out everyone nearby. The Tenryubito screamed in agony after a brief moment of eye contact and fell prostrate to the ground. Naruto had the mental capacity to withstand the sudden knowledge influx and the energy reserves to extend the technique as long as he needed. He didn't want to be the guy running around mending the ills in the universe, but this new world in particular was disgusting, dirty, and in need of cleaning. Additionally, it contained abilities that he found intriguing, such as devil fruits, haki, the marine's rokushiki, fishman karate, and sea stone. He wanted to observe these things firsthand, learn how they operated, and possibly add them to his arsenal of fighting skills. For haki and the rokushiki, he would learn fishman karate so he could instruct any hand-to-hand specialists he acquired in his crew. Fishman karate would be the easiest because he appeared to be one, followed by haki. He would then have to learn it by ear, but he could try to sneak into CP9 at the same time and see how that worked. Buu clones were really helpful. As he plotted, Naruto searched through the guard's memories that Goelmo had brought with him for any new information using the same method Nagato had used to discover one of the devil fruit users. Zoan, the lizard Nomi model, salamander, was able to coat herself with a waterproof substance as long as she routinely consumed her own toxic excretions, but she still had to deal with the problem of water. He had never claimed to be a saint himself, so he was a bit of a hypocrite, but Naruto had no trouble tearing off her explosive collar and throwing it so fast that it didn't explode until it was outside Majihua. Now he just needed a ship whose crew he could hypnotize into being his servants and getting him to Fishman Island so he could train in Fishman karate. This universe is in the year 1504, and the Devil of Revolution will soon give it a taste of freedom. Limetown on Fruit Forest Island * in the East Blue, 17 years later. In order to prevent any humans he encountered while learning haki and the CP9's rokushiki from becoming alarmed and thinking he was a fishman or a demon, Naruto had been using his henge technique to disguise his true appearance for the past 14 years. Over the previous 10 or so years, he had also been training an extremely large crew, the majority of whom, based on his recollection, were only slightly stronger than an average captain in the Marines. However, a few individuals he had trained into S-class combatants that he felt were on par with or superior to a Marine admiral. About 3 weeks ago, Naruto had bid a temporary farewell to the crew he had been training for about 10 years, instructing them to meet up with him in Logue Town to resupply and get armed with real weapons instead of the admittedly subpar ones he could manufacture with his transformative powers. He had been honest with them when he said he was going to find a few weak lackeys to fill out the crew's needs as deck swabbers and errand boys, and he was only going to train them to a level that was somewhat acceptable at first. He only had room for 2 more on the life ship that was a part of the mini-fleet he contained within the real, island-sized ship. Naruto smiled as he saw 2 likely-looking guys stumbling drunkenly out of the nearby bar. He would probably need to use a little finesse, but as inebriated as they were, he would have no trouble making none of what was about to happen seem unlikely to them. Having the lackeys serve 2 purposes, being capable guards while they were away from their ship and being errand boys, would be nice, especially if they left someone strong behind to deal with any truly powerful opponents. Naruto used his power to create a moderate and blunt wind that pushed them into him, staining his clothes. "Ugh!" he exclaimed as the bottle spilled over his seemingly expensive clothes, which were actually just parts of his body that were shaped and behaved like cloth, and he said, "My new outfit. This cost me nearly 10,000 berry." The 2 landlocked sailors, who didn't have any money in the pouches they kept for such on their belts, and the smell, which wasn't strong enough to suggest they had been at sea recently, immediately fell to the ground and started pleading for forgiveness from the man who appeared to them to be either a fishman of some kind or one of the devil fruit users of legend. "Well, I am a few hands short for my next voyage, a couple of deck swabbers, or maybe just general errand boys, wouldn't be unappreciated. You work on my vessel as far as Logue Town and we'll call it square, though be warned that there'll be a number of stops," Naruto grinned. "Or I could just take the cost out of your hides." He had become adept at putting on a front of casual cruelty to get what he wanted from the weak of will. After all, Kurama had something valuable to offer their union. Naruto was dejected if that was all it took to be strong in the East Blue. The two paled before nodding vehemently, and he started to walk back to his ship, with them following him melancholy. His ship was docked in Orange Village, a nearby more or less ghost town, save for those absurd clown pirates led by that inept man named Buggy. After a minute, he said, "So, names?" After a moment, the taller of the two said, "Jackson Belmont," in a somber tone. He wore a simple green shirt and brown trousers, and his face was long with a small scar on his chin that resembled a waning crescent moon. He carried a large dagger, which appeared to be a cross between a kukri and a trench knife, on his left side, and his pastel-colored navy blue hair shaded his brown eyes. "I'm good at knots, so riggin' and tyin' down the cannons and such is what you're like to use me for if ya want to get the best out of me," he said. He would be a good counterbalance to Kirkland's positive energy, and if he was even slightly proficient with that dagger, he could be turned into a good nakama and not just a guard dog on the ship when the real fighters left. However, he would probably still be left on the ship with the guard dogs when the others left, but he would be trusted to defeat any Logia, Zoan, or Haki users who dared to invade Naruto's territory. If Naruto could turn him into a legitimate fighter, which he was confident he could. Jackson made a noise and began speaking after the other gave a sullen nod and growled out a brief introduction that left Naruto noticeably underwhelmed. He didn't even attempt to listen or memorize any of it. Did you hear that, Captain?" Despite his apparent reluctance, he used the term with ease, and Naruto gave his approval. "Sounded like cannon fire, but from this far off? The only cannon we could hear from this distance would be Buggy the Clown's," he continued to impress. This type of situational awareness while intoxicated? He was a blessing in disguise. The other grew even paler as he stopped talking, and Jackson appeared to have accepted doing something he believed was too risky for him to handle. Very true, Jackson. Right then, my name's Majin Naruto, I'm your new captain, and since Buggy seems to have tried to blow something up and my ship is docked in that port, we've got to go investigate." He knew that the lackeys he had gathered were too disciplined to leave the ship to fight, so someone else had made port in Orange Town and was picking a fight that could end up damaging his ship. Naruto gestured for them to slow down once they heard the sounds of fighting approaching and walked casually towards it. As they started to run towards the town, he heard the sound of cannon fire once more and the sounds of fighting. When they arrived, they saw a boy wearing a red vest stretching his arms and corkscrewing a huge lion into the ground before removing the man holding it. "Oh, so there's someone in this world with powers like that, huh?" Naruto laughed and said, "Well, I'm taking that lion you." He pointed to the smaller one, whose name he couldn't remember. "Go to the ship, it's the triple-masted blue galley without Jolly Roger, and bring back a few of the crew." The passphrase for identification is, "And the wind swept forth to quell the tides of injustice, bring back 8 of the crew to take this lion back to the ship with." Jackson and the other man perspired as they hurried off to fulfill his crazy new captain's orders. And we're going to stay here and guard my new pet? It might be intelligent, so it may become a crew member. Oh, and I have the perfect devil fruit for it, and for you, Jackson, Naruto added. You're going to give me, a man you've only just met, a power like a devil fruit? What if I try to kill you with it? Jackson questioned, giving him a crazy eye stare. Naruto was just chuckling. You could try, you wouldn't succeed, and we'd just have double up on your combat training as a disciplinary measure. Jackson's perspiration fell. They waited until a bear-like man with a rather thick beard woke up and tried to attack them. Naruto was not amused and threw him through a nearby house's window, through the opposite wall, and finally out of town and into a tree, which finally stopped his momentum. Naruto got up and accompanied his crew back to the ship when the sounds of fighting from a moderate distance had subsided a little. As they got closer to the ship, he heard a rumbling sound and sensed two presences that were obviously strong enough to be on his crew, and nearly strong enough to start counting as one of his weaker nakama, rushing towards him. He then noticed two small dinghies with a strangely familiar woman untying them up at the harbor near his ship, which had a large dent in it. His ship had likely been hit by the cannon Jackson had mentioned. He ordered the men to move away from the main road so that the two men who had dealt with the man who had damaged his ship could pass unhindered. The boy who had given him the lion and a three-bladed swordsman were Roronoa Zoro, who was the only man in the East Blue worth anything and known for using a three-sword style. The boy's goofy smiles gave him the appearance of being related to Garp, and if left alone, they would likely end up assembling a powerful crew. Once on board, Naruto gave the men instructions to take the new deckhand to the empty storage room where he used to train new recruits and have someone start his training. He then turned to Jackson and the lion, whose name he had barely heard was Richie and who was now awake and somewhat bewildered, and grinned with his arms spread wide. So, you two are the newest additions to the real crew I've been putting together, not the guys who are just barely at the level where they can be useful against real Marines in a fight, but the ones I can call nakama. As such, the two of you are getting a choice. I can train you in your fighting abilities as they are right now in whatever haki you have, or in haki and a devil fruit power. The lion simply nodded, intimidated. What fruit do you offer and what is this haki? Jackson asked, clearing his throat because he lacked an instinctive understanding of persons in positions of authority. Ah, good questions, Jackson. Richie, pay attention. The large cat nodded. Haki is the power of the spirit within all living things and is dependent upon the willpower of a given individual. There are three types. The color of observation, which allows for sensing the presence of an enemy and the prediction of enemy attacks and thus allow you to dodge attacks that you might otherwise not see coming or be fast enough to dodge. The color of armaments, which is more varied in that it can be used as armor against attacks, as a weapon of pure force, as an augmentation to physical attacks made with weapons, or as an augment to the force of attacks made with your body. And the third type of haki, one which cannot be trained into a person but must be with them from birth, the color of the conquering king, which allows one to overpower the wills of others and render them unconscious without touching them. The two nodded dumbly, having never thought something like that could exist. Further, one may have any combination of the three, and they can be used to break through the defenses of devil fruit users, if they have any, much like sea stone renders their power inert. When Naruto signaled that he was free to talk, Jackson held up a hand and said, "And the fruits? Which do you offer?" "Well, I have two right now, a Paramecia class fruit whose power I don't know, and a Zoan class fruit which I believe to be an offshoot of the cat fruit. I've been told that the other fruits taste horrible, so, yeah," Naruto answered. Jackson, "I'm going to give you the Paramecia because it'll be easier to tell what it does if we can talk it over." Richie, you are going to get the Zoan because I think it could affect you in a different way and the experiment seems intriguing. I guarantee that it will do you no harm." They nodded again, more firmly. And Naruto grinned before he gave one final tidbit of knowledge. With a strong enough color of armaments you can keep physical matter from touching you, including water or sea stone, thereby foregoing the weaknesses of the devil fruits. Before they turned back to Naruto, they exchanged glances, with Jackson clearly feeling intimidated by the large, predacious cat and a little uneasy about it having some kind of intelligence that allowed it to participate. "We'll take the path of the devil fruit and Haki," Jackson said, and Richie simply nodded. Naruto's smile expanded as he presented two fruits that he had acquired in some way, somewhere, from somewhere, and he gave one to each of them. Jackson's fruit resembled a big apple, but it was blue, with a pig's tail stem and a gleaming silver inlay in the shape of spirals. He took a bite and realized right away that it tasted just as awful as the others were supposed to. He nearly choked. Richie sniffed at his fruit, which was an oblong, lime-green object with darker green polka dots, a long, slightly curved stem, and some forest green leaves growing from the base of the stem. After deciding it wouldn't kill him, he ate it all at once, and it tasted just as bad. After they swallowed, the effect was immediate in both of them, but Richie was the only one who changed in appearance. He had grown to almost twice his original size, and his teeth were slightly smaller than before, with his upper jaw growing past his lower jaw. He had also gained muscle in almost every part of his body, giving him a stockier and more intimidating appearance. He had also developed a third pair of legs and shoulder blades close to his forepaws, and his ribcage was a little longer and more robustly constructed, as well as a pair of eagle's wings between his two sets of forelegs. A mythical Zoan type, huh? Cat fruit, model, winged six-legged Smilodon it seems, said Naruto with a voice of curiosity. The beast opened his mouth and tilted his head, revealing a mouth full of fire that erupted and engulfed Naruto. Richie quickly closed his mouth and sniffed at the still-burning fiery pillar, and Jackson gasped and started to pray for the man he had all too soon come to believe would propel him to greatness. Naruto, however, had substituted himself at the last minute with some firewood from across the deck. He chuckled, drawing their attention to himself. "Very well, breathing fire is a good special property in my view. All right Richie, I want you to do a bit of experimentation to see if you can change back," he said. The chimeric beast nodded and trotted off to the opposite side of the ship to do so. Naruto turned to Jackson and watched him. "Well, no physical Ks to give us a clue as to your powers," he thought for a moment before snapping his fingers and letting out a shout of delight. "I'm going to attack you, it's going to seem real, and I'm going to force your body to use your new power through instinct," Jackson paled. 6 weeks later in Kokoyashi Village, Konomi Islands, East Blue. He hadn't been here in years. Just after those two girls Belmere had adopted had grown accustomed to him, so he was a little nostalgic that they probably wouldn't remember him. Naruto grinned as he and his crew sailed into port on the small archipelago that contained one of his favorite tangerine groves. He was glad that he could finally take off his henge because this village and his entire crew knew not to fear him in his true form. His favorite little hellion, Nami, was crying and calling out something as she repeatedly stabbed her shoulder, which had a tattoo of a pirate's Jolly Roger that indicated fishman origins. He did a double take, looking over everything in one sweep as he usually did, but then going back over it when he noticed several important differences. The adults were few, the children were glum, the air seemed to weigh upon him in depression. He was going to make things right since he had a special connection to this region and had been preparing to claim it as his domain once he gained notoriety as a Yonko. Jackson, hold down the fort, Richie, with me, he called to his two newest nakamas as he drifted in the air after leaving the crow's nest. When Jackson yelled his approval, Richie flew up to join him. He then took off for the town center, where he had seen Nami in the distance, with Richie right behind him. He landed just as she called for assistance, and the Orange Town kid in the straw hat placed his hat on her head. The kid yelled loudly, and Naruto struck him in the head. With an annoyed tone, Naruto uttered, "Oi, brat, shut up for a second and then tell me who drove the little hellion to this so I can kill him." Huh. So cool. What are you, like a devil fruit user? Did you eat some super awesome fruit that made you a lizard man? Ooh, ooh. Join my pirate crew, you can be our ship's well, I'll think of something, but you definitely have to join my crew, the child exclaimed and leaped up, pointing at him. Naruto was a little taken aback that the child could say all of that in a single breath. Even so, he refused, saying, "Absolutely not, I'm not a pirate, I'm a revolutionary, and you're too weak to be giving me orders at any rate, now," and he proceeded to say, "Tell me who did this to her," a little bit of his conquering king's haki. "He's mine, if you want to come along and take care of his shitty lackeys, then that's fine by me, just don't die," said Naruto, who knelt in front of the girl and lifted her face up to look at him with a finger. "You may not remember me, hellion, but I was a friend of Belmir's. I came here to see you and little Noji-chan one last time before I headed off to destroy the world government, but now that I know you've been terrorized by this prick Arlong, Naruajizan is going to go and make him die for you, K?" said the boy with curly black hair and an absurdly long nose. He turned and felt out the third largest power on the island, the first being his by a truly enormous stretch, and the second being Richie's. It was the kid's, then, and the fourth time, he got up into the air and calmly took off at a moderate walking pace for the others to follow, should they so choose. She jolted when she saw his face, and again when he called himself Ajizan. As he floated towards the gates, he encountered the two men guarding them and glared at them, causing them to shakily move aside. He then proceeded to cut a hole out of the gate with his eye lasers. To be honest, the part of him that came from Namikaze's Naruto always made him smile when he used this power. "Take that too, San, I did get an eye laser technique," he said, clearing the people who were waiting at the gate simply by his presence. "Arlong," he said in an uncompromising and firm voice, "you made a girl that I helped to raise cry, and commit physical violence upon herself in an attempt to remove your Jolly Roger." He let go of his iron grip on his haki and used its color of armament to knock everyone out of his way, including the fishman in the garish chair, who was clearly the leader. "For this, I will kill you, slowly, with my bare hands," he said. "And who are you supposed to be?" Arlong asked him with a grimace of annoyance and beady little eyes. "Some puny human who ate a devil fruit and thinks he can stand up to the might of a fishman," he said with a certain arrogance in his voice. He laughed mockingly and went on with a smirk, saying, "Your arrogance is insulting, but I'll humor you." He gestured for the fishmen who were standing behind him, including his three strongest by Naruto's senses, to step in and stop him. "If you can make it past these comrades of mine, then I will deal with you personally," he said. The interdimensional being inspected them before turning to face the child and his nakama. The man in the suit targeted the man who appeared to be a fishman karate practitioner, the swordsman targeted the man with 8 arms, and the child targeted Arlong. Naruto intercepted him and diverted him to the man with enormous lips, while the long-nosed child aimed pot shots at the other fishmen. "You seem to be under the impression that you're in control here, you gutless maggot, you aren't, and now you're going to die like the dog you are," Naruto retorted, his tail flicking irritably as he stalked towards the fishman leader. Once he was close enough, he punched the enormous fishman in the chest, sending him flying through his chair and the wall behind it into the building. When he didn't return after a moment, Naruto assumed he would have to go in and get the shark-like person himself. He was somewhat relieved when the man used a long, serrated sword that vaguely resembled the guy's own nose to smash down the wall, if only to save time chasing after him. Arlong saw an opportunity when Naruto turned his head to see how the others were doing, and he slashed down at his face. Without turning away from the others, Naruto caught the sword between his index and middle fingers, broke it, and stabbed the end into his enemy's thigh. At this point, a large cow monster appeared in response to the octopus man's call. The beast sat up straight when Naruto called out to him, "Richie, take the cow out," and then he left them alone and focused entirely on Arlong, who was stumbling back on a bum thigh before falling on his ass. Naruto cracked his knuckles and moved toward the man before starting to smash his skull in as slowly as he could, which required 15 punches in total. He then got up and wiped his hands, feeling remarkably better for having accomplished something constructive. He then turned to face the others, who were still fighting, with the exception of the child in the red vest, who had finished his own fairly quickly based on his opponent's appearance. Naruto finished with it, and he raised a hand to the building behind him and built up an energy blast. As it struck the building, the entire area was instantly vaporized, along with a good amount of the vacant land behind it. Before the angle he had fired it at sent it into the air, bathing the area for miles around in a dark, yet somehow pastel-ish, pink-purple light. The fishmen retreated, but the marine captain who was approaching them now did not. "The prick is dead," Naruto declared without introduction, "and I will personally annihilate anyone who causes grief to the people of this island again with extreme prejudice. This is the only warning you'll get from me, the devil of revolution, Meijin Naruto." He started, "Okay, hold it right there," and Naruto, irritated by the man's tone, decked him in the face. He didn't make it through the ordeal. The other Marines nearly ran away, but Nami trapped them and forced them to rebuild. Had Gosa been destroyed? Strangely, she also demanded that they return the almost 100 million berry that they had allegedly taken from her. After yawning, Naruto turned to face Nami and said, "Well, you little hellion, I've gotta get out of here. I need to get on with destroying the world government and the Tenryubito. See ya next time we happen to cross paths. Richie, you can bring the bones you can carry with you. Come on, we've done what we can and this place can't afford to resupply us at the moment, let's go." The big cat got up and trotted off after his captain, "Oh, and Nojiko," he added before continuing without waiting for a response. Some of them asked Nojiko and Nami who he was, and they simply smiled and said that they didn't know, aside from his name, Meijin Naruto, and that he'd called himself the Devil of Revolution when he'd first introduced himself to Belmere years ago. They all stared after him. The mysterious creature who had suddenly appeared in their lives, solved all of their problems, and then left just as abruptly. The two men who had been watching the gate then fled after him, pleading with him to allow them to join his crew. After an indeterminate amount of time, Mariehua, it earned Naruto a sextuple-digit bounty, one of the highest starting bounties in recorded history at 178,500,000 berry, and the epitaph he had chosen for himself. Luffy received a token bounty of 15 million berry for his loose association with Naruto and his own fairly adept fighting ability, while Nami received a bounty of 3 million berry for having a closer association with Naruto but little real battle capabilities. The Marines who had survived the events at Arlong Park informed their superiors about the events, including his plans to destroy them. The others were judged not deserving of a bounty. 2 months later in Logetown, Polister Islands, as they pulled into the port next to one of the 7 other life ships that he kept in his island-sized ship that was anchored near Reverse Mountain according to his energy-sensing abilities, Naruto gave a grin to Richie, Jackson, Johnny and Yasaku, the latter two having impressed him with their stalwart and earnest desire to be as strong as Zoro, the man whose coattails they'd been riding on for so long. He'd taken them on initially to allow a pair of the older errand boys to get off ship since he could tell they didn't want to work on the ship anymore. But they had grown on him after a day or so when they'd managed to draw his attention away from the back eighth of Jackson's armament hockey training. It had been amusing, watching them struggle through the basics that he put errand boy guard dogs through. But they did it so fast that Naruto was sure they were predisposed toward swordsmanship, but hadn't had the training needed to bring out their latent potential. The most he taught the guard dogs was top-notch observation hockey, some light armament hockey and some fairly decent swordsmanship, but it still should have taken them a couple of weeks to get through, not 4 days. Thus, he had taken them under his wing, given them each a unique kind of blade, and offered them some guidance. Rewind. "You two amuse me," Naruto said, introducing himself. "So what I'm gonna do is train the pair of you in swordsmanship and the 2 hockey that you can feasibly use," he said, turning to face Johnny. "You're a bigger guy, you're naturally tougher and physically more powerful, and I'm gonna train you in a heavy sword style, and when we get to Logetown I'll get you a better quality sword than that thing and then beef that up with one of my special abilities," he said, grinning. Yasaku put his hand up and started talking. "You are gonna get a 2-sword style involving lots of quick spins and hard kicks, because you're a bit smaller and more agile by nature. When we get to Logetown I'll get you a daisho set that I'm gonna buff up in a somewhat similar way." The man with the headgear nodded and continued, "Now then, you were given a basic rundown of how observation hockey works when you went through the basic training the other men have gone through. You activate your soul and use its innate 6th sense to keep track of your surroundings and the presences of others. It also gets a read on a person's intentions, which allows for the accurate prediction of actions, particularly attacks. Now," and here he grinned somewhat evilly, "armament hockey is whole different kettle of fish. For armament hockey, you've got to manifest a physical representation of your soul. Because of this, some people have unique types of armament hockey, like instead of an invisible armor, they manifest, say, a 3rd limb that technically isn't there but is still capable of interacting with the real world." The 2 nodded. "As for a devil fruit, I'm sorry to say, but I don't have any more of them." "Well, I suppose that just means I'll have to work you beyond human capability." They began to sweat. He tossed them each a pair of wrist and ankle bands. "Here, put those on. They've got resistance seals on them, meaning that they'll make it seem like you're moving through thick mud. They're self-adjusting up to the point where once you take them off you'll move at roughly 322 kilometers per hour. Make sure to practice without them every few days to make sure you can keep up with your new speed." They were dumbfounded, and it was the start of Naruto's day's fun. End of flashback. They smiled back, and Naruto was reassured that everything would be alright. They were all on a fairly equal strength level, with Jackson, surprisingly, having the best control over their hockey. Richie and Jackson had the advantage of not having resistance seals and also having devil fruit powers, but they were less proficient with their own bodies and weapons, though Jackson was becoming very good at using his devil fruit ability in his fighting style, which relied on using the range that most people were unaware he had. Nevertheless, with the seals off, Yasaku and Johnny were more often than not tied with Jackson and Richie. As soon as they disembarked from the ship, they were encircled by Marines. One of them was probably the captain, and he had a pair of cigars in his mouth, many more strapped to his coat, and a jutty made of sea stone near the tip. When the smoker replied, "Heh, the demon of revolution, here in my territory? This is a lucky break," Naruto raised an eyebrow. After giving the chain smoker some time to speak, he began, "Well, your delusions aside," saying, "I'm here to take out the military base, the shrine to Gold, Roger's death, kick you all off the island, and buy some equipment for my men. If you annoy me too much, I'll have to destroy you along with the base." The captain sneered and moved to use his jutty, but Naruto allowed it and gestured subtly to his crew to allow it as well. Smoker's perspective. Smoker, the captain of the Logetown Marine Base, had encountered many arrogant pirate bastards in his time, but this one was by far the most daring. He felt that it was offensive that everyone would fold before him like a deck of cards because he had some Zoan-class devil fruit that made him appear intimidating. He then proceeded to use his Nanoshaku Jit, and the idiot gestured for his men to stand down, so confident of his superiority and certain that no one could defeat him. In a single motion, he pulled out his Jit and hurried forward with his white launcher, which connected solidly as he had hoped. What was surprising, though, was that the man didn't move a millimeter and appeared completely unaffected by the sea stone on the tip of his Jit. Smoker would soon dispel that belief. Normal point of view. Naruto merely stared at the man after he tapped him with a glorified billy club. He continued to stare at him while he tried a few more attacks and even when they splashed him with seawater. He then used a small amount of armament haki to ensure that the Logia user remembered the fight before throwing him and his crew into what he thought was their boat and sending them off with a light kick. They would likely stop before they collided with anything. He then gestured for Johnny and Yasaku to follow him and ordered the rest of the crew to follow him, including Richie to guard the ship. He recalled that Kirkland was near the area of town where most ship-related shopping took place, including the weapons dealer. Actor was on the life ship, Urilla was with her, and Delpo was nearby. "Actor, I know you know I'm here, start heading back to the ship. The girls and I will swing by in a bit with the supplies," he called. He heard his ship's doctor say, "Aye, Captain," and knew the man was giving orders to the other life ship. Naruto then led Johnny and Yasaku to the shopping area by Kirkland and the others, and he informed Jackson that he needed to return to the life ship by 0900 tomorrow if he still wanted to be a member of the crew. They heard a woman shouting about her glasses as they got closer to the store where he was going to pick up Yasaku and Johnny's weapons. Shortly after, they arrived at the location of the shout and saw Roronoa Zoro and a woman wearing glasses in front of another sword store. Naruto shrugged and carried on to his destination. On his first visit to Logetown, Naruto helped a down-on-his-luck man by giving him a few hundred bari to start his business. After he had done some recruiting in the South Blue, he had responded to the question of his name with a somewhat tongue-in-cheek reference to his moniker. On his next visit, which was almost a year later, he had run into the same man again, who had paid him back for ostensibly helping him start up his life again after a devastating financial blow by making him a co-owner of a company named after him. It was nice to be able to stock up on weapons for a quarter of the usual price, so long as he didn't clear out their inventory in the process. Additionally, he had the honor of being able to provide any member of his actual crew with top-notch weapons from a private inventory of the excellent items that Aiden managed to obtain, such as Kirkland's armored gloves or Metris' weighted chain, which featured a massive spearhead on one end and a really nasty spiked bit for the weight on the other. Today, he entered and shouted, "Hey, Aiden, I'm back. 2 new crew members are here to pick up some swords, so I'm going to check the reserve, all right?" As the current cashier gave him a strange look, he heard confirmation from the back of the store. Naruto then proceeded to the door leading to the upstairs area where the reserve stock and its records were kept. Given that each weapon was labeled, it wasn't really necessary. When Naruto first entered the room, his gaze was immediately drawn to the centerpiece, which made him smile as if nothing were wrong. It was almost exactly like Johnny's old blade, the Kubikuribocho, and if he didn't know any better, he would have claimed that it was actually Zabuza's. It had a similar shape, not as curved near the top, but that wasn't a big deal. It had a complementary curve on the other side that made it narrower at the tip and vaguely resembled a hook sword, but only on a Zanbato. This curve was bladed, but the rest of that side wasn't. It had several indentations along the center of the blade, as if it had once had jewels embedded in it, but there were no nicks from the jewels being scraped out. Gutting Sword Silmic, Grade, O Wazamono, was written on the plaque beneath it. The man looked at it incredulously and then turned back to Naruto, who had spun on his heel and pointed at it. "Johnny," he said. "I'm part owner and half of the value of the stuff in here is mine to do with as I wish. 3 of that thing is about 1/5 of the worth in this room, go on take it." The sword was, in fact, the only one in the room of higher quality than Ryo Wazamono that was of the proper size for the heavy sword style he'd been learning anyhow. Yasaku took a little longer to peg. There were several sets, but they were either too low grade or not the right kind of blade for his style, too bulky, as it were. Eventually, though, Naruto found what he was looking for in 2 different places. The first was the larger sword, which was about 3½ shaku in size. It was an Owazamono, and its name was Akuyama Ten no Kajiyu, or Evil Mountain, Orchard of Heaven. It was said to be impossible to lift to someone who wasn't worthy of wielding it. Yasaku felt that it was just the right weight, and he added that it seemed eager to prove itself. Naruto gave his approval. The other half of the set was a Seijo Owazamono named Mukujin Kizoku, or Indefinite Nobility, who was slightly larger than a Wakazashi's shaku limit but still within the proper size range when paired with the Akuyama Ten no Kajiyu. Although he had no known special abilities, he was known to have been instrumental in a number of battles. On his way out, he grabbed a better quality Jackson's blade because he had a hunch he would need it. It didn't have a name and wasn't graded like Johnny and Yasaku's blades because it wasn't a sword, but the material was pricey and the craftsmanship was excellent. Naruto was uneasy about the knife's placement, though. When he got back to the ship, he saw Richie attempting to keep Kirkland and Urilla at bay by alone while the majority of the crew was unconscious on deck. This was probably done by Delpo, who he could sense was searching the ship's interior for more of what she probably believed to be invaders. Kirkland, in her hybrid salamander form, was spitting poison at him and attacking him with her armored gloves with spiked knuckles that had been modified for the Aksanjet dial. Richie couldn't really handle the poison, which was a thick, heavy fog of toxic gas, and the only way to deal with it was to avoid it or learn not to breathe. Richie could dodge it if his observation haki were stronger, but at the moment, it only seemed to work for him when he needed to avoid a crippling blow. His defensive armament haki was quite strong, and Kirkland didn't have what it would take to break through it on her own, holding back as she was to try to avoid killing a non-marine, non-pirate combatant. However, she wasn't alone. With the raven-haired Urilla and her bladed tonfa at his side, along with her carbon powers, Kirkland really only needed to provide ranged support. Urilla's armament haki was one of the strongest he had ever seen, able to slash through any defensive armor he had seen, with the exception of his own, and her carbon powers allowed her to manipulate the weight and density of her tonfa to do even more damage. He would have to see how long Richie could last, with a little assistance from Johnny and Yasaku. He shouted out, "Johnny, Yasaku," and they awoke like hounds who had heard their master's call. "Help Richie, this will make a good test for how far you've progressed," he said. After Johnny and Yasaku joined the fight, Naruto gave a sharp whistle to draw the attention of the girls as the two swordsmen ran to help their comrade. They looked over at different times, and when they had a chance, he nodded to each of them in turn, letting them know, in his own way, that these people were crew and that this was a test for them now. They smiled and began to use their skills a little more viciously, knowing that they had been holding back. The novices were both broken in and broken out. Naruto and the others left for their next destination, the actual ship, in the morning after Jackson arrived and pleaded for Naruto's forgiveness. It appeared that Jackson wanted to return to his home on Fruit Forest Island and teach them how to defend themselves from pirates like Buggy, which Naruto could respect. Jackson promised to pay him back, so Naruto waved the new knife he had gotten him as a parting gift and wished him luck. It had been upgraded with seals for increased durability and sharpness the previous evening, along with the upgrades for Johnny's new sword, Silmic. With Jackson gone, Naruto turned to the now conscious Johnny. "I've made a few improvements to your sword," he said, making Johnny goggle at him, casually upgrading an Owazamono grade sword, one of the 33 most powerful swords in the world. Naruto smiled indulgently at him. The blade was a touch dull, likely from the previous owner's neglect. Still, the metal was expertly worked and of the finest quality I've seen in some time. I gave it a bit of serration on the inside edge of the hook and gave it some seals for durability and an improved ability to hold its edge. Johnny grinned at these facts. His sword probably looked even more awesome now than it had before. It also now has a seal that makes it weigh less, by roughly 200% without affecting its mass. This means that though it feels like it weighs as much as the cutlass you've been using, it's still as hard for your opponent to stop when you swing it as it should be. The seal is reversible though. I can make it heavier for you to train with. That's a different seal than the gravity seal though. Naruto held out the sword to his new crew member. Almost instantly after Johnny hurried to take it up and sit down to inspect it, Yasaku, who was now awake as well, turned to him with hope and said, "Hey, Aniki, have you finished mine yet?" Naruto regarded him admiringly. Although it appeared that he could possess a lightning element, the interdimensional Dragon Toad Ninja was unable to confirm. "I can do it whenever I want, and I have the general idea in mind, but first I would need to know where you feel most at ease with potentially dangerous situations. In strong winds or close to a big fire? Are you amid a lightning storm or seeing a rock slide in the distance? How do you handle large waves?" Yasaku appeared doubtful of the significance of this and was going to respond as such before shrugging. He didn't understand much of what Naruto asked of him until Naruto clarified it. Probably the high winds," he replied firmly before asking the straightforward question, "Why?" "Just something I wanted to know for when I upgrade your swords," Naruto said, grinning enigmatically as he carried Yasaku's two blades back inside his cabin. He placed them on his ceiling workbench and thought a little more about his intentions. Based on his response, he believed that Yasaku's chakra was fire-natured because he could use strong winds, similar to the ones he had inquired about, to fuel fire-natured ninjutsu. In order to prevent Yasaku from dying of chakra exhaustion, he would need to have the seals on both swords draw in and transform his chakra into fire-natured chakra, so that it wouldn't drain him too quickly, as well as the mass and thus weight multiplication seals he had intended to use for the Akuyama and the durability and sharpening seals he also planned to use for both. He would also need to provide them with an emergency backup that would gather natural energy and hook that into the conversion matrix, as well as an emergency shut-off that would activate the natural energy gathering matrix to prevent Yasaku from dying from chakra exhaustion. Finally, he would need to have heat-resistant seals to prevent the blade's temper and heat treatment from being ruined. Naruto would enjoy watching Johnny relearn how to wield a sword while that beast weighed him down. He had done something somewhat similar with Johnny's sword, but only he had been able to determine that Johnny was earth-natured on his own. An earth-natured sword would only make it heavier mid-strike as its mass increased. Your first sword is done, the Akuyama Ten no Kaji-yu is now much more badass. It's got more weight on it, I put the seals on it for that, but it still feels like it weighs the same to me. It's also got seals for durability, sharpness, and a special surprise, behold. Naruto said after 6 hours of intense seal work, carrying Yasaku's longer sword, the Owazamono known as Akuyama Ten no Kaji-yu, the sword exploded into flames as he neatly drew it. Yasaku exclaimed, "So cool," in admiration of his freshly enhanced blade's greatness. With a joyful squeal reminiscent of a fangirl, Naruto sheathed the blade and gave it to Yurmukajin, saying, "I'm having a clone do the same thing right now, but without the extra weight. It should be finished in an hour. In the meantime, Johnny, come spar with me over here." It was a 3/35 shaku falcata-style sword with 2 cutting edges, though the second, on the back of the blade, stopped before the blade became concave near the middle, and a 1/47 shaku hilt wrapped in thin but sturdy crisscrossing leather cords for grip. Naruto called as he retrieved his own blade from his room, a Seijo o Wazamono known as Mugen no N**, or the Edge of Infinity. With the exception of the leather grip wrapping and the gem spike, the entire object was mirror-like silver in color and exuded a sense of indifference. Its back featured a cross-guard-like shape reminiscent of a Scottish claymore, and the pommel featured a dragon's claw clutching a large spike-like diamond. Naruto had also added seals to it, which probably made it more powerful than Dracul Mihawk's renowned Yoru. It was heavier now, or at least felt heavier, thanks to a modified resistance seal. In actuality, though, the blade resisted being moved while it was unsheathed, and the settings were so high that it took strength to move it at Mach 2 to get it moving at speeds that could be used in a sword fight. None of Naruto's crew had anything like that strength, and he doubted that anyone in the world today possessed it, except Kizaru, who could probably unsheath and attack with it if he did so while in the form of light. Additionally, it had the standard sharpening and durability seals, as well as a seal to improve the blade's one ability that Naruto hadn't given it, the ability to gather light within its mirrored edge and release it with a slash. Prior to the addition of his seals, the light would disperse into a very bright flash, primarily serving as a distraction tactic. However, now that the seals were in place, the light would concentrate into a laser-like aura that remained along the edge, increasing the sword's cutting power and extending their range, for however long Naruto deemed necessary, without adding weight. "Are you sure you want to fight me with a sword that small, Aniki? I can put some real force into my blows and you probably won't be able to block too well without a heavier sword of your own," Johnny said, acknowledging that Naruto's blade was much smaller than he had initially thought. "Johnny, I'm doing this to help you learn something, not boost your ego. If I didn't think I could stand up to your blade with my sword, I wouldn't have asked you for a spar, I'd have asked for some pointers. Now, give me your best, or I'll tear you apart in seconds," Naruto said with a humorous snort before responding. Before Johnny's, admittedly limited, observation could warn him that it would happen, Naruto's sword was up and blocking his blow. Haki blocked his heaviest slash without even a millimeter, and Johnny bounced off his captain's sword and used the momentum to twist into a horizontal slash. Once more, he didn't even realize his captain had moved before he felt his sword stop in its tracks. His captain always blocked before he could see him move, and Johnny never used momentum from earlier slashes to give his blows more power, so he was able to move the sword an inch or even a millimeter from where it had blocked him. Johnny came in at every angle his skill and his blade would allow, even the rare stab and diagonal slash that took him longer to recover from. He lowered his sword and put it back in its scabbard after realizing that he was bleeding in multiple areas from small scratches. "If you're that fast and strong and don't even look like you're straining to keep the pace up, then there's no way I can beat you now," Johnny said in anticipation of the question he was certain Naruto would pose. Naruto said, but what exactly was I attempting to teach you?" After pondering for a few moments, Johnny started pacing for a few more, clearly having trouble coming up with an idea. After 2 minutes or so, he looked up and said, "Well, I don't think it's anything like, there's always someone better. We learned that fairly well yesterday against Urilla and Kirkland. I'd say, probably something about appearances being deceiving or not making assumptions without feeling out your opponent." "Yes, that was part of it," Naruto said with a chuckle before nodding somewhat ruefully. "The most important thing was that you had to know your limits or you'd bang your head against a wall you couldn't climb alone for hours and get yourself hurt," he said, nodding toward him once more and grinning approvingly. "It seems like you already knew that I might have been teaching you something like that, so you didn't even think that I might have been teaching you something like that. This is the full extent of your lesson: know your limits and ask for help if you need it, or you'll get yourself killed doing something stupid," he said. "Don't underestimate an opponent just because they look weaker or slower than you," he said, dropping his smile and sheathing his sword. "Now, I noticed you were a bit sluggish in your forms, like you weren't used to the weight of the swords. Do so once a day until I tell you otherwise." After the first round of weighted, slow-motion katas, Johnny almost passed out. 2 days later, after meeting the real ship and introducing everyone, they arrived at a certain location on the Red Line, the only supercontinent in the world. Naruto knew this was the right place because he had marked it with a dense crystal filled with chakra, which was the largest chakra source for hundreds of miles around, especially at sea level. It was also quite close to Reverse Mountain, the Grand Line's entrance, where he intended to begin his breakdown of the Marines' power in Alabasta, one of their more notable member kingdoms. However, he would have to find a way to get there. Reverse Mountain wouldn't work for them because the river was too small for even their smaller life ships to board, let alone their island-sized real ship. They would have to brave the Calm Belt and its sea kings, which would tear apart ships of all sizes, or enter the Marines' Gate of Justice, which was a ridiculous name. Naruto didn't like either of these options, so he devised his own. It was a nightmare to complete because he had to use water-natured chakra manipulation to keep the array dry below sea level until it could fully dry and become waterproof. He had to do it by proxy with clones who had limited chakra reserves, and he had to fill that trench with water from his reserves to prevent the sea level from dropping more than was manageable. He had used Earth-style ninjutsu to dig an incredibly large tunnel through the Red Line and then covered it with a genjutsu seal array that stretched around the entire rim of both sides. As he guided the helmsman, a human male named Calvin Delph, through the genjutsu screening the tunnel's entrance, he said that he had probably altered the world's currents with this tunnel and that it would only be viable for a few months, maybe only weeks, depending on how good they were at searching, before the Marines found it. He had curly brown hair, no shirt, and a large Susumita sitting next to him, leaning against the railings to the left of the wheel. Delph's weapon was similar to Gamaken's in that it had rounder, more robust fork-like parts for similar reasons and spikes for greater use as a club than a crowd control or criminal detainment device. Naruto didn't have to put as many seals on the Susumida to prevent injuries from its reject dials because, for some reason, he couldn't turn off his armament haki, though he still had to reinforce that because it still had a wooden shaft. He was strong and knowledgeable about the Rokushiki, having mastered all but the secret final move that combined all 6 other forms into one devastating physical attack. He was a force to be reckoned with on this planet, on the level of a Yonko or Admiral, Naruto would wager. Being moved from apprenticeship to apprenticeship during his boyhood, he was also somewhat of a handyman until discovering his calling in making the most of a ship's agility, which allowed him to repair the most of the minor damage that didn't need to be done by a shipwright. Fortunately, he didn't intend to allow them to stay for very long, and he believed that the tunnel was only truly required for one trip. The guards and errand boys got along well, which was good, and if they were unhappy or rebellious because of crew rivalries, it could result in 1 or 2 unfortunate deaths on his nakama's part. He looked out onto his ship's deck in the dark of the tunnel, lit on either end by the natural light of the day, with the other side still only a faint spot of white in the distance. There were 15 of his nakama, and each of them was at least a vice admiral now that Richie, Johnny, and Yasaku were present. Either Hakubi Minaka, his ship's sharpshooter up in the crow's nest, performing lookout with the extensively modified weapon Naruto had handcrafted for him and given him, or Met Rice, the female half-giant with the weighted chain and the power of the speed no Mi, were likely his strongest. Even by human standards, Met Rice was fairly attractive, lacking the somewhat lopsided and disproportionate limbs of most other half-giants. She had forest green, close-shaved hair that was probably even darker when allowed to grow. Her face was a little thin, but her features were sharp and noble-looking, with high cheekbones and full lips. Her eyes were blue, and she lacked eyebrows. She tended to flaunt her figure in skimpy clothing, as young people were often known to do on this planet, given that she was only 19. To the delight of the men on board, she enjoyed embracing her co-workers when she was happy, something Kirkland disapproved of, but Naruto saw nothing wrong with it and had asked Kirkland to overlook it for the sake of morale. She had both of the more common haki archetypes well trained, but because of her generally stronger constitution and rather extreme speed, which she could augment with the CP9 Soru and Jeppu, she usually only needed to use the color of observation. The rest of her Rokushiki was fairly good, but she frequently slacked in her training because she had never really had to try to take down anyone but Naruto. Naruto could only forgive her for this because she was still his best combatant in close quarters, and she had this look like a drowning puppy pleading with you to save it, which he just couldn't. She'd be fine when he left. Though Naruto couldn't see his eyes from where he was, he knew they were red, reminding him of Sasuke, Madara, the fake Madara, Itachi, Kurenai, and Kakashi. That was a lot of people with red eyes, and he was probably missing a few too. Hakubi Minaka was a scrawny man whose body didn't seem to be able to withstand the kick of his rifle, and his bald head was reflecting the light from behind him into Naruto's eye at the moment. He detested wearing shirts because they concealed the tattoos he had obtained while illegally detained in a marine prison. He wore them as a symbol of pride for having survived his 15-year sentence when he was only 5 years old. Naruto had never inquired as to where they were located because, with the exception of Impel Down, which was the worst of all, they were all essentially interchangeable and equally awful to live in, and they wouldn't let you leave Impel Down. Before Naruto picked him up, he was a very good shooter with a rifle and pistol, and he wasn't too bad with the new, for this world, shotgun style of mid-range firearm in hand. Naruto had taken the details of the guns Bu had seen in the worlds of his universe and the knowledge he had gained from the blue-haired women in the red dress who had taught him about them, and he had designed and built him some much better guns. The upgrades from flintlock tech to lower-end back-loading cartridge systems made to work with the commonly available ammunition gave Hakubi a much higher rate of fire and greater accuracy because of better rifling work in the barrels made from much stronger steel-derived alloys. In fact, Naruto thought they were more like a more deadly version of airsoft guns from Boo's original reality. His shotgun was now more akin to a flame-plasma-magma thrower, his rifle was more akin to a rapid-fire bolt-action rail gun, and each of his 4 pistols had an impact dial on the bottom of the ammo cartridge for use as small but powerful clubs, and a flash dial in the barrel. Fortunately, he had enough spare dials to make him multiple ammunition cartridges for his pistols and rifle. The various parts of his pistols were too small to hold more than 2 dials each, and there wasn't enough surface area for him to create any truly stunning seal arrays. He had a significant advantage over most opponents because his Rokushiki was well honed, his Rankyaku was particularly powerful, and he aimed it well. His Haki, both armament and observation, were fairly powerful, but what was strange was how his observation Haki appeared against a faraway opponent. He could use it at range to accurately predict where his opponent would be over the next few minutes, a greater predictive capability than any other recorded case of observation Haki that Naruto was aware of, while allowing him to maintain an active focus on his current surroundings. Then came his other nakama, whom he had trained for about 10 years. She was Kirkland, the woman he had rescued from slavery in the home of the so-called Saint Goelamo, a life of constant beatings if she did something out of place, and whom he had made his first mate. Her chestnut brown hair was long enough to reach her mid-back, and it was wavy, as if she had styled it. She had never done it, and she thought those who did it were frivolous. Despite this and her past, her bright green eyes were eager, and she had a positive and vivacious attitude toward most things. Along with her protective gloves, she donned a loose-fitting white shirt, an unbuttoned black vest, a knee-length flowing skirt, and shorts that resembled the ones that girl, Haruno Sakura, had worn after returning from that training trip with his godfather. When he had first seen them at the armory, they had been some sturdy leather gloves lined with a bit of well-worked steel over the arms and a thin bit of seastone over the knuckles. However, he had gone over them with a sealing array and used a seal that turned any man-made material that came into contact with a natural one gain one property from the natural material in question, turning the leather into an impregnable wall around her hands and forearms. Soru was one of the fastest members of Naruto's crew, and she could use her axe dials to perform a sort of 1-2 combo with her Rankyaku. Her Shurgan was not up to par, and he was cheating by using his abnormally powerful eyes to copy her. She could even focus her armament Haki into the projectile attacks of the axe dials, something he had only seen himself duplicate. Additionally, there was Delpo, the brunette with yellow eyes and a slight butch who was built along fairly broad lines and served as a devoted guard. Her sky-blue hair reached her shoulders, and her no-nonsense demeanor made her equally intolerant of foolishness and injustice. Her ancient Zoan-class devil fruit gave her the ability to transform into a beast known as a Xenosmalus, a large saber-toothed cat that was almost as large as the Smilodon. When she was halfway through her transformation, she was one of his crew members with the strongest physique. She had tried to approach him in a bar after he had finished learning everything he had wanted to know about this world's combat. He had politely declined, instead asking her if she was interested in joining his crew because he had sensed her superior strength. She had said that she would, if he could defeat her in an arm wrestling match, but that if he lost, he would have to go on a date with her. Of course, he had won, even after she had changed into her hybrid form. Her preferred weapon was a large solid iron tetsubo, or spiked club, with seals on it to absorb recoil so that the reject dial he had modified it with wouldn't kill her with its excessive backlash, and the usual seals to improve the weapon's durability, which also helped the weapon stay in one piece when the reject dial activated. Her armament hockey, the only kind she had wanted to learn to use, was fairly strong, and her speed in any of her forms was good as well, though Metrice always defeated her. In regards to her Rokushiki, she was able to utilize it and it was rather strong. However, she rarely used it in combat, and Naruto was unsure of why. Though the scars on his upper arms and torso were typically concealed by the overcoat and suit he wore with the sleeves rolled up, Actor, his ship's doctor, had storm-gray eyes without pupils, which made his nearly daffodil yellow shoulder-length blonde hair stand out on his person even more. He also had thick, broad scars from battles long past, both pale from age and red with the rage of a recently inflicted wound, crisscrossing his arms, chest, back, and face. He had served in the Marines for a short time as a young man under the then Lieutenant Commander Doberman, who is now a Vice Admiral. The Marines' almost strict adherence to their absolute justice, even among the more relaxed ships, had quickly soured him to them, and he left after his thankfully brief commission was over. He then tried to join a pirate crew, hoping that they would at least be more honest about the fact that they were terrible people, but this also let him down, as the few crews he joined were awful, admitted it publicly, and even made a respectable income, but he couldn't find any reason to truly care for the majority of them. He then wandered for a few months, practicing medicine wherever he could, until Naruto discovered him and offered him the opportunity to overthrow the Marines and their seat of power with the world nobles and the Gorosei. His casual demeanor belied a spirit of fierce warriory, and his battlefield medical prowess was equaled only by his use of a mercury cutlass that had been modified with a heat dial to increase its lethality, as well as a buckler made of high-grade steel that Naruto had rendered nearly impenetrable with seals of various strengthening and shock-absorbing effects. His armament hockey was rather unique in that he appeared to be unable to use it offensively, only defensively. His mercury fruit powers allowed him to manipulate his cutlass into a variety of shapes, from a whip that resembled a razor-thin wire to a short club, and his tekai was more akin to a kongakai. Yurila's slim, toned body was dressed in a sleeveless royal purple button-up shirt and black cargo shorts, with a long, forest green sarong slung low on her hips and a semi-sheer, black lace shawl draped about her shoulders. Her bladed weapons could retract into the main body for safe and easy storage or in case she needed the opponent alive. Her violet eyes had a sly glint that said she could talk her way out of an arrest for political assassination. Since he had interviewed her using a Sharingan-style hypnotic suggestion to tell the absolute truth, something he had done to the entire crew, Metrice excluded, even though he didn't know much about her past, he felt no real need to pry because she was capable and hadn't shown any signs of plotting against or loyalty to world nobles. Everyone else seemed to want to pry, but Naruto told them not to, because it was her business and she would tell them about herself if and when she felt like it. She was not one for easy smiles or light-hearted banter. Her interests were more focused on practicing her weapons or having serious conversations than anything else. However, when Naruto needed something to lighten his mood, her dry wit was more than welcome. Johnny seemed to have a crush on her, and she seemed to be playing with the idea of getting involved with him. Given their personalities and her general disdain for him before a few hours ago, Naruto assumed that she was more likely to need some sort of diversion from internal turmoil than an actual attraction. Either that or the fact that he had the audacity to flirt and try his luck after the beating she had given him had impressed her. Foreman Kolb was a man with a bright orange Jufro hairstyle. His blue eyes were a bit too big for his face, and his large lips made his nose look small in comparison. He had the typical pinkish-white skin tone that defined the most noticeable human skin tone Naruto had seen on this planet, and he lacked gills or other fish-related features. He wore the typical sailor's attire, which included a sleeveless shirt for ease of movement, loose pants for the same reason, and good shoes with excellent traction to help reduce the risks of a wet or slippery deck. All of these items were semi-dark. He was fortunate to have come from the Cooking George, the only survivor except for Red Leg Zeph, and had worked there for 6 years after stowing away from home in a fit of foolishly idealistic teenage rebellion. During that time, he had observed Zeph and learned how to fight with his feet like a chef. His jump abilities, acquired while he was a ship-hopping stowaway, helped him develop an aerial fighting style based on powerful acrobatic kicks from odd angles. Naruto's training had made him an even more formidable opponent, as he was able to use his jump powers in midair and launch three-dimensional attacks. In order to give thrust kicks and jumps more power, he wore knee-high armored boots with impact dials on the bottom heels and jet dials on the Achilles heel. This was a wise move when he could also make those kicks ridiculous for this planet's levels. His kicks occasionally gave Naruto the impression that someone had tickled him, which was far better than most people on this planet could ever hope to do. In any case, he used Rankyaku. Her name was Kamakura Haze, and she was a woman of lower than average height, with long, straight black hair, indigo eyes, and a penchant for skirts and low-cut tops. She was a reserved woman, cold with almost everyone except the Nakama, with whom she relaxed enough to have a conversation without coming across as a rude, arrogant shrew. Her merchant handled all the bargaining for ammunition, food, medical supplies, and the like. She avoided combat when she could, refusing to learn armament haki or the Rokushiki's Rankyaku. She had no weapon and used Shurgan to incapacitate opponents without killing them. She was an expert in observation haki as well as the other 4 fundamental forms of Rokushiki, Kami-e, Tekai, Soru, and Jeppu. To his surprise, Metrist's most intense attacks left no scratches at all. For example, Tekai, Tainai no Shinzo Munashi, Iron Mass, the emptiness of the body's heart, used her mastery of Tekai to allow her to move like Kami-e and clear her mind of everything but dodging, and use her observation haki to avoid and tank those hits she couldn't avoid. And then there was Doral, known in some circles as the Great Tiger of the West Blue. The tiger shark fishman was massive for his species, at an enormous 434 1/3 centimeters, with straw-colored hair and an unsettling grin that was both happy-go-lucky and vicious. His eyes had been described by some as soulless, because they were entirely those of a shark, lacking visible pupils most of time because he consciously dilated his pupils so that they occupied most of his visible eye so as to catch as much detail of the goings-on around him as possible. He used fishman karate, Rokushiki, and that was it. He didn't use haki and he didn't use weapons, well, not unless he had to, and even then he'd usually just improvise something like a ship's anchor. His fishman karate was well polished and he practiced his Rokushiki relentlessly. Out all the Nakama Naruto had, Doral was in the top 3 physically, and capable of going head-to-head with both Minaka and Metrice and either just barely lose or tie every time. The others usually just got beaten, with moderate to half-serious effort, depending on who was fighting the 2 powerhouses, every time. Albrecht Russo was his final and most likely weakest, due to a lack of talent, as Naruto saw it, shinobi. He had thin lips and black eyes, and he wore a bandana with horizontal stripes of red and white that completely covered his hair. Naruto had never seen his hair before, so he had no idea what color it was. He also wore a loose-fitting, long-sleeved white shirt that he taped to his ankles, just like many shinobi from Naruto's home universe, though the brown boots he wore concealed most of that. He was the shipwright, spending a lot of time inspecting the ship for damage with some of the errand boy crew members, fixing anything they found. Albrecht had refused to let Naruto improve his sword, a Ryo Wazumono grade saber with a rare second edge on the back of the blade and a gentle curve. He believed that a sword should not be altered after it had cooled for the last time, general maintenance and necessary sharpening notwithstanding, so that the smith's original intentions could remain with the blade forever. He fought well and was, aside from Naruto, the ship's most technically proficient swordsman. He had been picked up with the same scam as Jackson, Delph, and probably 80% of the guard dog level crewmen. Albrecht had been assigned to the latter, guard dog duties, but he had publicly rebelled against this and demanded either release from the ship or training on the other Nakama's level. Naruto respected his level of unbreakable gall and had given him more training, which he had eagerly accepted. He was the only crew member who was genuinely interested in learning fishman karate, aside from haki and the rokushiki, and he had learned them all fairly well. However, he wasn't as naturally talented as the others and grew in strength more slowly than they did, which had been the main reason Naruto had wanted to place him with the guard dogs. Because they were his crew and he had given them proper training, Naruto felt they would be able to handle anything the world threw at them as they headed for their first target. A few minutes into their voyage, as they set sail for their next destination, Kolb approached him with some moderately inconvenient news that compelled Naruto to postpone his intentions. "Hey, Captain, who did you send to pick up the food supplies?" "I was just in the EA's dine-in all and we don't have enough citrus-wise stuff to last week," he said in his odd accent. Naruto swore and yelled, "Plot a new path, whatever island is closest and can offer us with the essential material," to the navigator, ordinary crewman, not a Nakama, who was a few meters away and was looking at some maps. He turned to Kolb and said, "Vitamin C, yeah." He was already plotting the new course when Naruto nodded in agreement and turned to make sure the navigator had heard him. "Let Delph know when you have the new course plotted. I need to go find something to beat that can hopefully take it," he said, turning and stalking away as the majority of the crew made sure to stay out of his way. When Naruto pulled into port at Whiskey Peak, he noticed a body floating in the water close to the docks. Judging by its bloated appearance and the state of its clothing, it appeared to be fairly old. He gave his men instructions to fish it up and started trying to figure out why the location was making him uneasy. At that point, Minaka slid down the halyard of the mast closest to him and landed a few feet away without making any noise. "Minaka, more bad news?" Minaka didn't describe himself that way unless he had something urgent to say, Naruto inquired in a wry tone. The man laughed, amused by the fake dismay Naruto had shown him. "Indeed, the place is a ghost town, or near to, couldn't see anything moving in the entire place, and the buildings show signs of a recent battle," he sighed. Naruto didn't say anything but impatient tisk sound and repeatedly tapped his right. "The battle seems to have been fairly widespread, most of the town has at least superficial damage, and the place where there is the most heavy damage looks to be scorched, likely by some sort of offshore bombardment. There aren't any bodies though, which is strange. If it had been pirates, they'd have left corpses and maybe a Jolly Roger to show who'd done it. If it were the Marines, there would be people around still, and likely some sort of repair effort would be underway. I want a platoon out there 5 minutes ago, no group smaller than 5 and one of the others with each group. You get back up to the crow's nest and watch out for the attackers. If they return, I want them captured at the least," Naruto said, nodding and issuing orders. He had to give credit to whoever completed this task because, whatever it was intended to do, it had probably completed its task. "Sir," the sniper said, and hurried to give the orders to the men. Naruto's mind darkened a little as he considered what this might imply. Asterisk the Mugen no En's blade is in the following style: 2 BP blogspot_AbeQ V24DWC/TJT5UHNKULI/AAAAADE8/YCSHO_GP49K/S1600/Falcata 2 SV1 JPG. Just remove the spaces. The hilt is in this style, though it's wrapped for gripping because it's so much longer, and it has the spiky diamond, Higanakami, 5MP/EU/Hanlapkapek/Higanakami/0VTDVT2X/Arididi/Falcata 1, JPG. Again, remove the spaces. The back of the handguard is in this style: www. Swordsoft Product Images /Scottish/Swords, Scottish, SH2060N, Blade, JPG. Again, remove all the spaces. The entire thing is a mirror-like silver, lots of shine. And now, Chapter 3. I know I said Del AGR would be out soon, but after that last chapter of Multiverse, it kind of stalled. Then, I told a person who PM'd me that Del AGR would have 12K words of actual story and be out in about 2 months because I couldn't do 6K in that time because muses are stupid, dirty, flighty bitches who can't live long enough for me to keep certain promises. I cleaned up what I had a little bit and posted it before this thing died horribly. This thing, however, introduces you to Naruto's Nakama and gives you a little backstory on most, if not all, of them. Jazz hands with a dull glittery effect, failing to evoke the excitement as intended. Alright, so it was mostly filler, but they'll still be in Alabasta for the entire Baroque Works thing, even though their ship is slower than dirt due to physics. In any case, I think you guys should try reading the new Demon. I got it from a guy who put it up for adoption a long time ago, and it has occasionally given me some excellent things. Even if it's not so great at first, I believe I was able to bring it to a respectable place. And the plans, oh, the plans. You could like it. The first of a series of OMACs that take place during the time jump that will be coming up in the next chapter, and which I will be posting every 3 to 5 chapters, is the reward for my loyal readers who have persevered through this lengthy wait for this update. They are titled, His Reality in Truth, PT1, Freedom. As Naruto emerged from the vortex, he noticed that he had entered a small room that nearly hit the ceiling. As he started to look around the room, which measured about 17 feet by 15 feet by 8.5 feet and change, he heard a door open somewhere else in what appeared to be a building. Aside from being small, the room was fairly comfortable, especially when compared to the apartment he had had as a child in his home universe. On the opposite wall was what appeared to be a personal computer on a desk. The room had 2 doors, one of which had a poster that read, Wikipedia, manga with Ichigo? That pile of plastic cases on the floor, was that Cloud on the cover of a game? Before Naruto could do more than try, and fail, to comprehend these facts, the door on the adjacent wall opened. His unrivaled gaze then turned to the room's presumed owner, noting the Prophet poster above the TV next to the bookcase and the Goliath poster next to it. His clothes were a little worn, but still comfortable, and when he saw Naruto, which was impossible to avoid given the amount of space he occupied, he looked down at the device in his hand, which appeared to be some kind of touch screen. The man, boy? He looked pretty young, scraggly, uneven, facial hair, rosy cheeks, below average height for a human in most worlds where humans existed, was slightly overweight. His eyes and brown hair were dull with boredom before they registered Naruto's presence. He paused, looked serious, and brought up the device, which had an English-language message on it. "No, that's not posse dash, wanna read? Well, it's about you." "Sure," he said, lightly grasping the device, uncertain if it would withstand his grip. Perhaps something stranger than this had happened to him, but Naruto couldn't recall if it had. However, rolling with the blows, metaphorical or not, had saved him from more unpleasant and/or strange situations than he could count, so doing it now was more or less instinctive. It was uncanny to read from the first chapter of "And the Multiverse Fell." The word choices, the intent, everything, he read more and more. After 12 hours and a number of chapters he didn't want to count later, Naruto put down the pad and got up from the bed he hadn't realized he'd been sitting on. Someone was writing about him and his life. Were they watching him? Even now? They had to have some way of seeing the future to do so because, and god damn it, his thought processes were, fuck, damn it, stop, no, he was still thinking the way the story had explained he would, perfectly, exactly the same, and he couldn't stop even though he was doing everything he could to get out of this train of thought. When he turned to face the boy, he saw that he was sitting on the computer in the corner, typing. He had just clicked something, and the screen was loading something else. Was that? He moved closer, and his body was moving and he couldn't stop himself, like when you watch a train wreck, and you want to look away, but your body won't move. Where did that reference come from? Anyway, he could see what the boy was typing, and it said, Kataisen. This was Kataisen, the author of his reality, the kid. He couldn't have the tech on that computer, could he? Why was this still? Naruto felt a jolt, as if reality disconnected. How did he know that feeling? And he was suddenly moving in the way he wished again. When I realized who you were, that you had come here, the child said, but Naruto was only partially paying attention because he seemed to be free of control. I knew that at least one version of you was still susceptible to the power of my writing, that at least one version of you was still limited by me, and whether or not I was writing, or that perhaps all of you were, so I tried to write myself out of the picture for at least one of you. An alternate reality where, when you came here, reality disconnected for a second, and broke the bond. If you experienced that, then this is an unscripted reality, or a reality where we're both unaware of the script, as it were. There's nothing in the omake after the words, and Meijin Naruto was free, truly free, to make his own decisions for all of eternity, in every universe of every multiverse of every existence. Naruto's jaw did drop at that, and he made his first real, unfettered decision.